And so in chapters 16 through 18, we're going to look at civil war between father and son. Many people have said the American Civil War is interesting because it was brother against brother and father against son. Literally, in this Civil War, it was the exact same thing. There were households divided between the father being with David and the son being with Absalom, or brothers being with David or with Absalom, or with those who were once David's inner circle who have flipped to his son, Absalom. So this is a very trying and emotional time in the life of David, and not to mention his son is the one who's leading the charge against him. And so here we have in verses 1 through 4, Ziba's kindness. Now, does anybody remember who Ziba was? It's been a couple of weeks. Ziba? All right, Mephibosheth, that's right. And he was his kind of caretaker, his servant, if you will. And so Mephibosheth had his crippled feet, and Ziba was the guy who kind of looked over his fields, because if you've got two crippled feet, it makes it really tough to be a farmer, right? So Ziba was kind of the general manager of the estate of Mephibosheth, who's living in David's palace. And so David is fleeing away from his son Absalom. And it says in verse 1, when David had passed a little beyond the summit, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of donkeys saddled, bearing 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a skin of wine. And the king said to Ziba, you have brought these. And Ziba said, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who faint in the wilderness to drink. And the king said, and where is your master's son? And Ziba said to the king, behold, he remains in Jerusalem, for he said, today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father. Then the king said to Ziba, behold, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. And Ziba said, I pay homage. Let me ever find favor in your sight, my lord the king. And so Ziba brings all these gifts to David while he's fleeing, and he says, these are for you. And he says, where's your master? Right? Where's Mephibosheth? And what does Ziba say? Where? He's back in Jerusalem. He's a traitor, right? When he heard you were fleeing, he said, surely the Lord's going to give me back what's mine, right? Saul's kingdom, my grandfather. And then we're going to see a little bit later on, I've got 19, 24 through 28. We'll see that passage next week, but that's not what Mephibosheth did at all. So who's lying here? Ziba. Why? Yeah, what does he get in return? He gets the farm, right? All the workers, all the cattle, all the goats, everything. He gets it all, just in this one moment. And we'll see what happens in chapter 19 when David finds out that Ziba wasn't completely honest with him about the whereabouts of his lord, Mephibosheth. And so then you get Shemel's curse in verses 5 through 14. And here David is fleeing Jerusalem with his tail between his legs. His son has brought up a rebellion against him. And here we see that Shema is going to give him a curse. If you would, let's read verses 5 through 8 and 11 through 12. Verses 5 through 8 and 11 through 12. When the king came to Bahurim, there came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera, and he cursed continuously. And he threw stones at David and at all the servants of the king, and all the people and the mighty men were on the right hand and on the left. And Shema said, he cursed, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, at whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood. Verse 11. And David said to Abishai and the servants, behold, my own son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjamite? Leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord has looked on the wrong done to me, and the Lord will repay me with this good for his cursing today. And so he's fleeing the city, and then this relative of Saul keeps hurling these insults on them. And what does this descendant of Saul say the reason David's suffering is? He's a man of blood, right? Is he right? Yeah. All these things that David is experiencing, they all come directly from chapter 12. Right? In chapter 12, who is cursing God there? Do you remember? Who curses David in chapter 12? Didn't know it was going to be a pop quiz, did you? Nathan. And who is Nathan speaking for? God. So who's cursing David in chapter 12? It's God. And all these things are taking place just like chapter 12 lays out. And so David hears this man hurling these curses upon him and saying, you're experiencing these things because you're a man of blood. And does David believe him? Yeah. Is there some truth to it? Yeah. And so, maybe Shimei takes a little far, with his cursing and his rants and throwing rocks at the king. But he's got a point. David has brought these things upon himself. And so David doesn't act out in anger. If you remember back to 1 Samuel verse 25, somebody else said some pretty harsh things to David. You remember who that was? David was looking for provisions during the sheep shearing. He went to get some of those provisions for his man. And he's been the anointed king of God's people. He goes up to this man whose name means fool. And he says, my Lord David needs some stuff. And he says, who's David? This runaway slave I hear about? Now who was that? Abigail's husband. That's exactly right. And his name was? Nabal. Right? Now when David heard those words, what was his initial reaction? Yeah. He said, get your swords on, right? Almost literally, that's what he said. He was going to kill everybody in the household. He says, every male in that household, I'm going to kill. If it's a male dog, he's dead. Every male in the household is about to die. And that's when Abigail runs out and meets him and bows down and brings the food and the provisions. So look at how David reacted then to somebody's words, and look how David reacts now. Is David a little bit wiser in his older age? Probably. For those of you in your 60s, are you a little more patient and cooler-headed than you were in your 30s? No? Some of you are like, not really. I just got to decide if it's worth getting out of my seat for or not. But yeah, so maybe David's a little bit wiser. He was a little more patient, a little bit older. And maybe not. But he seems so here in this passage. And so we see that God's curse is being fulfilled. Let's look at verses 20 through 22 of our passage. And so here in this passage, just to give you some background information, Absalom has gone into the city. And so he's there and he's asking, what should I do? And we see that Ahithophel is in the city also. And Ahithophel was one of David's closest counselors. The biblical text tells us that his words were regarded as prophecy. It doesn't say it was prophecy. It just said that he was so wise that when he spoke, people listened. And most of the time they did what he said, because he was just so wise and so smart. Look at what he does in verses 20 through 22. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, give your counsel. What shall we do? Ahithophel said to Absalom, go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all of Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench to your father, and the hands of all those who are with you will be strengthened. And so they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. In the ancient Near East, it was common for the king to have relations with the former king's concubines as a sign of his strength, as a sign of his power, as a sign of his complete reign, and utter kind of a backhand slap to the previous king. And so Ahithophel says, well, now that you've overthrown the king, this is what you need to do. And so that's what he does. It's interesting. Where was David when he saw Bathsheba?
On the roof.
On the rooftop. Where does this take place?
On the roof.
On the rooftop. I wonder if there's a connection there. Well, no, I know there's a connection there. Because if you go back and you look at 2 Samuel chapter 12, where God is giving those cursings to David, listen to what God tells David in verses 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel chapter 12. Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will raise up an evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes, and I will give them to your neighbor. And he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun, for you did it in secret, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before all the sun. So, did God's curses when David sinned against Bathsheba come to fruition? Yeah. Just because you've repented of sin doesn't mean consequences won't come back around to bite you in the butt, right? And so that's what David is experiencing here. And so, like I said earlier, the curses laid out in chapter 12, that's what takes place throughout these chapters where David is on the run from his son Absalom. What he did transgressed the law of Moses. It may have been an ancient Near Eastern custom, but it broke Leviticus 18, 7 through 8. And so Absalom was more interested in gaining power than he was by following the Word of God. And so we see that take place here in chapter 16. Now, chapter 17 talks about the downfall of Absalom, or how it's going to take place. And so we get to chapter 17. David's on the run. Absalom's enjoying the good life with daddy's house and daddy's girls and daddy's things and all this stuff. And David is sitting here trying to figure out what he's going to do. And so David's on the run, and Absalom's like, you know what? I'm tired of playing games. I want to kill Dad. Like, I want to end this right now. And so who's the wisest guy in the kingdom again? Who? Ahithophel, right? Ahithophel's the wisest guy. So who does Absalom go to and ask for advice? Well, naturally it'd be Ahithophel, right? And so he goes to Ahithophel and says, what should we do? And the first few verses of chapter 17, 1 through 13, Ahithophel says, look, you need to get a band of guys right now, because your dad hasn't even crossed the river yet. And we can get there tonight. And if you give me a band of men, we'll go over there and we'll kill David tonight, and you'll be king. And you'll end this civil war almost immediately. He says, you know what, that's actually a really good idea. But Hushai is also in the kingdom. Now, if you remember back a few chapters earlier, he was one of the men that David sent back into the city to figure out and to spy what was going on. And so Hushai is sitting there, and Absalom goes, what do you think we should do, Hushai? You're one of my dad's, councilmen as well. He says, no, we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't go at night. We shouldn't go too quickly, because your dad's a man of war. I mean, he's a warrior. I mean, yeah, you've revolted against your dad, but I mean, he's subdued like 8 kingdoms. He was on the run for Saul for 15 years in the wilderness. If you think you're going to get an army and catch him at night, Saul looked for him for almost over a decade. So your dad's already in a cave somewhere. You're not going to find him. What we should do is we should gather all of our troops, and we should outnumber them in an open battle. And that's what we should do. And so he listens for a while, and he says, you know what, Hushai? I like that idea. Let's wait. Let's have an open battle. And that way all of Israel can see that my forces can beat him on the battlefield. What does Hushai play up? Anybody remember anything about Absalom's physicality? His physical traits? The prettiest guy in the kingdom. Like David Beckham cute. You know what I'm saying? Like cover of GQ. No, I don't think he's cute. I'm just saying like it's what I've been told. Cover, he's on the cover of magazines. All the girls talk about him. He's in music videos. Anybody remember his hair? What about his hair? Long. Cuts it every year, and he weighs it, and it's 5 pounds, right? He's got the most beautiful face in the kingdom, the most beautiful hair. I mean, Chris Hemsworth? Thor?
That's kind of what I see when you say all that.
You might want to check into that, Wes. I'm just playing. Okay, Chris Hemsworth, right? Not David Beckham, okay? Yeah, the hair too, okay, exactly. And so, just super good looking guy. He's really prideful. He's been told his life how good he is. And so Hushai, he's been in the same palace with him most of Absalom's life. He knows. So he plays up to his arrogance and says, no, we should meet them in open battle. And he says, yeah, that's what we're going to do. That way everybody can see and hear about what took place and beat them in the middle of the day. And so here we have an answered prayer. Look at verse 14. Verse 14 says, And the king and all the people who were with him, oh, I'm sorry, that was 16. Chapter 17, verse 14. And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel, for the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. So the text here says that if they would listen to Ahithophel, God would have took care of David providentially. But what was the better plan? Ahithophel's, right? He's trying to win. He's trying to kill David. What is Hushai trying to do? Spare David, right? And so he tricks Absalom into listening to the wrong counsel. Now it's interesting because if you go back to chapter 15, verse 31, Alvin, can you read that passage?
Verse 31?
Yeah.
17?
15. Chapter 15, verse 31. As David is leaving the city of Jerusalem, he knows that Ahithophel is not his friend anymore. And he knows that Ahithophel is working for his son. And he also knows Ahithophel is the smartest guy in his council. Which if the smartest guy in the kingdom is against you, it's a problem. And let's hear the prayer that David reads, or that David says.
Then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness.
David prays, Lord, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And what happens here? Verse 14 says that's exactly what God did. God made it seem like Ahithophel's was wrong, so Absalom would go with Hushai. And so even though David is being punished for his sins, God is still providentially looking out for David. And then in verses 15 through 21, we get the spy chain. Now, I don't know about you, but I like spy movies and all that jazz. So let's go ahead and read verse 15 through 22, and let's see how the message gets back to David. Verse 15. And the king's servant said to the king, Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever the Lord your king decides. I'm sorry, I'm in chapter 15. Mercy. I was back there with David's prayer. Okay, chapter 17, verse 15. Then Hushai said to Zadok and Abiathar the priest, Thus and so did Ahithophel the priest. Thus so did Ahithophel counsel Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus and so I have counseled. Now therefore send quickly and tell David, Do not stay tonight at the fords of the wilderness, but by all means pass over, lest the king and all the people who are with him be swallowed up. Now Jonathan and Ahimaaz were waiting in Engrigal, and a female servant was going to tell them, and they were to go tell King David, for they were not to be seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So both of them went away quickly and came to the house of a man in Bahurim, and had a well in his courtyard, and they went down into it. And the woman of the house took and spread a covering over the well's mouth, and scattered grain on top of it, and nothing was known of it. When Absalom's servants came to the woman in the house, they said, Where is Ahimaaz and Jonathan? And the woman said to them, They have gone over the brook of water. And when they had sought and could not find them, they returned to Jerusalem. And after they had gone, the men came up out of the well, and they went and told King David. And they said to David, Arise and go quickly over the water, for thus and so has Ahithophel counseled against you. And then David arose and all the people who were with him, and they crossed the Jordan by daybreak. Not one was left over that had not crossed the Jordan. And so they had a chain of command. One guy couldn't flee from the city of Jerusalem and go all the way to David. That'd be way too easy to figure out where David was for Absalom and his army. And so here you see this chain of command. You've got the priests who were there in the palace eavesdropping about what is going on. They send word to a female servant who tells the two brothers who were soldiers in David's army. They flee across and go tell David. But before they can get there, Absalom is told that these two guys have just fled the city. So he knows something's up. And so they have to hide in a well. And so here you kind of see just what lengths they had to go to try to get this message to David. And so David departs across from the river, but after he does that, he gets help from other people. And verses 24 through 29, we see an unlikely group of men who are there to offer David and his soldiers provisions. One of those is Shobi, who's the son of Nahash, who had been the king of Ammon. And so one of the sons of the king that David had fought in battle and overtaken actually comes to David's aid in this time frame. One of those was Micah, who had been the host of Mephibosheth at some time, and then a very wealthy guy named Razalar, who was a wealthy supporter of David from another part in the country. And so here you see that even though David is on the run, David is being punished, his people don't have a lot of food and provisions, God is still sending people to look over him. And so in chapter 18, we get the actual battle that ensues between the people of David and the people of Absalom. And so listen to the orders of David here in verses 1 through 5. But before we do that, put yourself in David's situation. What if your son had taken the kingdom that you had worked so hard for? Remember, David was anointed how many times? 3 times. The first time he was anointed, what did he have to do? He had to flee from Saul for over a decade. Not a very luxurious life as a king, right? The second time he's anointed, where is it at? What city is he anointed at? Where's that? Hebron, right? And he rules there for how long? 7 years, right? And so for quite some time, he's not even the real king because the king is divided between one of Saul's sons. The third time he's anointed, eventually he's the king of the whole country. It's taken 20 years plus, to finally get what God promised him he was going to get. And then, what happens? Your own son rebels against you and drives you out of the city. What would you want to happen to your son in that situation? Remember, you got like 10 more, so it's not like he's the last one left, I don't know if that makes a difference or not. I don't know.
David's probably blaming his son himself, so we probably...
Yeah.
He gave orders, don't kill Absalom.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. He wants to spare him, which is shocking. I mean, because think about this. This isn't your average guy. I mean, David's a man of war. I mean, David has been a leader and a commander of armies. Thousands of men have been slain, both under him and against him in warfare over the last 40 years. I mean, death does not scare David. I mean, literally has seen hundreds, if not thousands of men die before his very eyes. He's not queasy when it comes to death or about killing people. I mean, anybody remember what David is attributed to when it comes to babies? Anybody remember? Nobody remembers that? We talking about that? That was Solomon. I'm talking about in battle whenever he would go to these foreign towns. Bash their heads against the rocks. That's David, the shepherd king. I mean, David's a rough guy. But when it comes to his son, let's look what he says here in verses 1 through 5. Then David mustered the men who were with him and set over the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, and 1/3 of the command under Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to them, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, You shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us, but you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better for you to stay back in the city. The king said to them, Whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the gate, and while the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands, and the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Hittai, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And the people heard when the king gave the orders to all the commanders about Absalom. And so David, he is personally making sure that all of his commanders, even the commanders over like the little, I was in the military, the companies, I don't know, like over 100 men. Like, you find Absalom, you don't kill him. Like, deal gently with them. When you find them, don't hurt them. Like, bring them to me. We're going to try to work this out. We'll go through therapy, okay? But don't hurt Absalom. And so they're going out, and then we see what exactly happens to David's son. And so we have Absalom's death recorded in verses 6 through 18. And in this passage we see that as Absalom is in the midst of the battle, we have an interesting thing that's told to us here in these verses. And let's read that, verses 6 and following. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated by the servants of David, and the loss was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than by the sword. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, and Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under a thick branches of a great oak, and his head was caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth. And while the mule that was under him went on, and a certain man saw and told Joab, Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. And Joab said to the man, What, you saw him? Well, then why did you not strike him to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and even a belt. But the man said to Joab, Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from our king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. And Joab said, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand, and he thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. And so, how is Absalom called again? By his hair. Should have cut his hair, right? That's right. That's why, men wear short hair, right? Because Absalom can get you in trouble. One thing's interesting, though. Verse 8, it says more men were devoured by the forest than by the sword. What on earth does that mean? 20,000 men is a lot of people. So how did the forest devour more than the sword? I've got no idea. It makes me think about the rebellion of Korah, and the earth split open and swallowed them. It wouldn't be the first time that God has used nature to defeat an army or defeat people. And so when it says the trees devoured them, it's a good question. I don't know. Sinkhole? We don't know because the text just doesn't tell us, but it seems that God is making sure there's going to be a clear winner and a clear loser, and the winner is going to be David. And so God is still on David's side, even though he is punishing David. Another thing is interesting is he's caught, it says by his head, but it probably means by his hair. And so when Joab hears the fact that this young man saw Absalom hanging in a tree, he gets upset. Why does he get upset? They didn't kill him. And what does the young man say? Joab says, I'd have given you, 10 pieces of silver.
He thought he'd be killed if he killed Absalom.
Yeah. He says, I don't care if you give me 1,000 pieces of silver. I'm not touching Absalom. We were all there when David told us. He told you, don't hurt Absalom. And what does Joab do? He says, I'm not wasting any more time with this foolish talk. And he picks up 3 javelins and throws it and hits him in the chest. Which makes me think of another time that Joab killed somebody against David's will. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Who's that?
Didn't remember his name, but he was going to deliver the other 12 tribes to him.
That's exactly right. He was a general. And David, he had left the king of Israel, right, who was over the other 10 tribes, Ishbosheth, and came down to David and said, I'm going to give you the other 10 tribes. And as he's going out to take the elders of the other 10 tribes and turn them to David, 2 people find him, Joab and his brother, and they kill Abner. Abner is the man that they kill against David's will, because Abner had killed Joab's brother in battle. So now it's twice that Joab has killed somebody against David's will. And so you can kind of see that Joab is a great military commander, but he's a hothead, and he has trouble sometimes taking orders from his king. Verses 16 through 17, they take Absalom and they bury him in a particular way. They put him in a pit and throw stones on top of him. And that is because a rebellious son was supposed to be buried in such a manner. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 20 through 21. And so it's interesting here that Absalom is buried according to the law of Moses for a rebellious son. Verses 31 through 33 tell us how David takes the news. Two men come back and tell David about the battle. The first man comes back and says, "We won," but doesn't say anything about Absalom. The second guy comes back and he tells David about Absalom, his son, and about he's been slaughtered. Verse 31 says, "And behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, 'Good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered to you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you.' The king said to the Cushite, 'It is well with the young man Absalom?' And the Cushite answered, 'May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man.' And the king was deeply moved, and he went up to the chamber over the gate, and he wept. And as he wept, he said, 'O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son.'" And so David mourns Absalom vehemently. Why do you think that is? Yeah. I'm glad you spoke up, because I think back to exactly what you said earlier in class. David felt responsible for what had taken place. Should David have felt responsible? Yeah. I mean, we all make our own choices, do we not? So Absalom has some fault to blame. But yet, David feels bad because he realizes that some of this he brought upon himself. Unfortunately, most of the bad stuff that happens in our lives, I mean, there are some things outside of our control. But if we're honest with ourselves, most of the bad stuff we bring upon ourselves.
Back at chapter 12, and where he tells him, "Nevertheless, by this deed, you have utterly sworn the Lord, your child who is born will die." Immediately after that, his new son is struck down. But maybe that's not what he's talking about. If you look back, he talked about rising up against you, and all that stuff. So he may have been, he might see, at the time I thought that this was my newborn.
Yeah.
What I've done has caused it to be the son who rose against me is going to die.
Yeah. And it could be double fulfillment, right?
Right.
Could be both. But no, I think you're right. I think David mourns here because he does feel responsible. He remembers those curses that Nathan told him. I mean, he remembers Bathsheba. Not only Bathsheba, but why is Absalom estranged from David in the first place? Because he killed his brother. Should he have killed his brother? Yes and no. He shouldn't have killed his brother because David should have. Under the law of Moses, David should have had Amnon killed. David didn't do anything. And so Absalom had to. And Absalom waited 2 years for David to do something. He didn't do anything. And so Absalom had to take matters into his own hands. And so not only should David feel bad for Bathsheba, he should feel bad for Amnon, because he should have took care of that, but he didn't. And so Absalom had to. Then Absalom had to flee, and then he gets estranged from David, and that whole mess starts to filter. Well, after Absalom leaves, does David try to repair that relationship with Absalom?
No.
He doesn't speak to him for 5 years. And even when he goes and tells Absalom it's okay to come home, he doesn't even go himself. He sends Joab. And so David mourns because I think David realizes, I could have done a lot of things differently. And some of this falls on me. And I think that's why David is just so upset here about the things that have taken place. If we choose to do sinful things today, it may come back to hurt us tomorrow. Even if we get our life right and back on track. Just because you're through with sin doesn't mean sin may be through with you. Sin has consequences, even when those sins have been forgiven. And David had to find that out the hard way. And sometimes we, like David, have to find out the hard way. And so next week we're going to look at chapters 19 through 21. And we're going to look at the aftermath, some of the things that take place once this war is over. Thank you so much for your questions and your comments in class. And appreciate the wonderful crowd that we have. If you don't mind, let's go ahead and end with a prayer. Dear Lord, we're so thankful for your word and for all the wisdom that we can glean from it. We're so thankful for your servant David and for his heart that he had towards you, even in the midst of his struggles and his sins. Dear Heavenly Father, all of us are imperfect, and we pray that we will look to you, and when we do things that are wrong or things arise in our life, that we will look to you for strength and for guidance and for forgiveness, if that need be the case. Dear Heavenly Father, please watch over us and help us as your people to love each other, to uplift each other, and help take that message to those who are lost. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.